In the 1970s, 1980s, I didn't know any punks who were right-wing, right-wing leaning or conservative in the conventional sense.
What are your first memories, your first contact with music, and why did you decide to produce music?
My earliest memories of music are my parents listening to records on a hi-fi that my father is an engineer, and he made a hi-fi from a kit. It was a vacuum tube hi-fi, and that was the most inexpensive way for them to have a hi-fi when they were a young married couple. And this would have been around 1958, 59 when they got married. And so when I was a child in the 1960s, the only music that I was aware of was my parents' record collection. And they had Johnny Cash and Hank Williams and, like sort of hillbilly music. That's what my father liked to listen to. And my parents grew up in a small town in Central California called Madera, California. Both my parents were born in Madera, but their parents were either immigrants or first generation from Italy. And so they were very Americanized in their tastes. But and so the music that I heard when I was growing up was, popular music from the early 1960s. And then music didn't really register to me, with me as a thing. My father played guitar, and he would, sing songs to us children and that sort of stuff. But it didn't make a musical impression on me. Then when I was a teenager, we were living in Montana, and my brother left to go to college. And when he left to go to college, I kind of inherited his record collection. And he had records like, Alice Cooper and The Who and, sort of standard 70s hard rock stuff. And I listened to those records and I liked them, but music still didn't really register as anything important to me. Then when I was in high school, a friend of mine introduced me to the Ramones. And the Ramones was just such a completely different experience from all of the other music that I'd listened to, that it really captivated me. And I became kind of obsessed with the Ramones. And then from being obsessed with the Ramones, I learned about the whole greater punk music scene, and then from learning more about the punk music scene, I learned about the whole underground music scene, which was, wider and bigger than punk, and, had a tradition that went back, 100 years. There was always an underground music scene in parallel to the mainstream music scene, and I just automatically felt more comfortable in the underground. In 1980, I went to Chicago to go to the university at Northwestern University. But in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, Chicago's a big city. I'll bet they have some punk rock bands there. And so when I got to Chicago, I immediately insinuated myself into the punk underground music scene there, and got to know a lot of the musicians in that scene. And I started trying to play in bands myself, and I had done some recording of my own band in Montana, and then my friends' bands in Chicago, and that's how I got started on the process of becoming a recording engineer, was just through the sort of social interactions within the music scene in Chicago.
What was the first piece of gear that you had, and what was the purpose of it too?
Well, the very first piece of musical equipment that I ever bought was a bass guitar, and that was specifically so that I could start a band with some friends of mine in Montana. We wanted to, we were all sort of crazy about the Ramones. We wanted to start a punk band, and so I bought a bass guitar and taught. I had one lesson. No, I had 2 lessons from an instructor. The store where I bought the bass, they had a phone number for an instructor. It's like, okay, this guy will teach you how to play the bass guitar.
Yeah.
My first lesson, I was taught how to tune the bass, like which string did what. Brilliant, very useful. I still use that every day. Then the second lesson was the difference between a minor scale and a major scale. And already I felt like that was too much information. So I had those 2 lessons, and then I was on my own. I wanted to be in a band. Drums was like way too complicated. You had to use both arms and both legs and count. That seemed impossible. Guitar seemed impossible. So many strings, so many notes, just seemed impossible. Bass guitar, 4 strings. I could handle 4 strings. That seemed like 4, that's a manageable number. Like, I have even more fingers than that, so that should be fine.
Yeah. Now I would like to talk a little bit about Shellac. The first song that I heard, it was Steady As She Goes, and it was on a Burn to Shine DVD series.
Oh, yeah.
And it was the Chicago one.
Yeah.
And then it's something that starts like...
Yeah.
And it was captivating me so much because of the energy.
When we're writing songs and developing them, we often play them live a long time before they're released as part of a record. Like the shows that we've been doing on this tour, for example, we've been playing as many as 5 or 6 songs that have never been released. And we finished an album in the summer, but it takes a long time to get through the process of manufacturing. Once you finish the record, it takes a long time to work its way through the manufacturing process. So that record won't be out soon, and it may take another year before it comes out. I don't know. There are big delays at the pressing plants now, and we don't have a real urgency about releasing a record, so it's going to take however long it takes.
Yeah.
But the songs are still viable for us, and so we're playing these songs. They just haven't been released publicly yet.
Yeah, it's understandable. Another thing that I would like to know is the first major album that got your name on people's mouth locally. It was Surfer Rosa, maybe?
Okay.
I think it was one that made you have some respect on the punk scene, and I think because of the drum sound that is so alive. It's like the band is playing in front of you, right? And how was the contact to make Surfer Rosa?
The Pixies were the first band that had ever contacted me who were not already people I knew, like either friends or friends of friends. They were the first band where a phone call came in from nowhere, and it was, hey, we'd like you to record our record. And the first contact actually was not from the Pixies, but was from Ivo Watts Russell at 4AD, which was their record label. He contacted me and he said, we have this band from Boston that we really like. Would you record their record? And I said, sure. And we didn't talk about money. We didn't talk about timing or anything. It was just sort of a very informal thing.
I can imagine.
And then I met the Pixies in person the day before we went into the studio. They sent me a copy of their demo cassette and their first record, their first EP. And everything seemed very straightforward to me. Like their music seemed well thought out. They were well rehearsed as a band. They had a very clear aesthetic. So it was perfectly suited to me at the time because I wasn't a particularly versatile engineer at that point. I basically only knew how to record rock music.
Still evolving.
And I was still learning even in that. So it was a good pairing because their expectations were realistic. Like they didn't want to make Sgt. Pepper or something, you know. So it seemed like a manageable situation for me. If they had wanted to make a record that was more complex than that, I don't think I would have been able to do it.
Not at the time, right? It was not your first album. Which one was the first one?
The first thing that I ever recorded that was actually made into a record was the Big Black 12-inch EP in 1981. Although, a few months prior to that, I recorded a demo tape for a friend of mine in Montana. A guy that I had played in a band with in Montana had a band. They were originally called Who Killed Society. And
cool name.
Yeah, Who Killed Society. And I recorded their demo tape for them at a local studio in Montana. Years ago, that demo tape was released. They were friends with the guys in the band Pearl Jam, and Pearl Jam paid for the release and distribution of this record. It was like this legendary lost punk record from Montana. So that record is actually the first thing I recorded that became a record, but it became a record 30 years after the fact.
And do you prefer to listen to the band playing live first, or do you prefer to listen to the demos and then meet the band and listen to them playing live?
Honestly, at this stage, I don't need to like have very much information in advance. If the band is familiar with my working methods, and if I'm even glancingly familiar with their style of music, and I think I can do a good job, then we can normally resolve things fairly quickly in the studio. If it's possible, I prefer to see the band live, or at a minimum, when they come to the studio, they set up and I'll listen to them play live in the studio for a bit, just so that I get a feeling of what their internal logic is, you know.
You cited Big Black, and the first time I heard it, I had a sensation of listening to something like a fusion of Kraftwerk and like something this way, but high on a punk sensation.
I was, and I remain, influenced pretty heavily by some of the early experimental electronic rock bands like Kraftwerk and Suicide and Silver Apples, and there was a French band called Metal Urbain and Cabaret Voltaire and Human League. Like there were a lot of bands in the late 70s, early 80s that were experimenting with a kind of mechanical quality, either an electronic, like a rhythm box, or synthesizers, or a hybridization of the rock band aesthetic and an electronic or experimental music aesthetic. And I was very heavily influenced by all of those bands. And so Big Black was kind of a synthesis of my influences at the time, which were punk bands and rock bands and underground music, plus this interest that I had in sort of electronic and mechanized rhythms.
It was a good experience for you to involve a bit more with sound engineering?
As a practical thing, most of the, I couldn't afford to go into a proper studio and pay someone to record my band, so I had to learn how to do it myself. And that was true for most of my peers in the underground scene. It was just, as a practical matter, it was too expensive to go into a recording studio, so we didn't do it. We did it whatever other way we could, And the sort of guerrilla method was to get a tape machine and bring the tape machine to the practice space and string up some microphones and record in the practice space. And that's how I did a lot of recording in that period in the early 1980s, was in this kind of a homemade fashion, DIY.
You refuse to receive royalties from the band, right? Because you think if the work is from the artist, it's a just thing for the artist to receive about it, and not you, right?
Yes, the easiest way that I can explain it is that when I'm working for a band, I'm working for a limited period of time. And I'm happy to place a value on my time and say, pay me for my time. That doesn't also mean that for the rest of time, I should be getting paid more and more and more again and again and again and again. That just seems unethical to me. If I work on a record for a week or 5 days or 2 days or 1 day, it doesn't seem reasonable to me that I should expect to get paid again and again and again for eternity, for that one short period of time where I'm working. So it's an arrangement that has evolved as part of the structure of the greater music business, that people are constantly siphoning money out of each other's lives. Like, if the band is playing a show, they may have a booking agent and a manager who are sound asleep while they're playing the show, but they're still taking some of the money out of that show. Yeah. And that, to me, all of those relationships seem parasitic and kind of unfair. And in the case of records, where a record may have a lifespan of decades, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, people are buying these records, it just seems absurd and insane that, every time this band makes a new fan and someone falls in love with this band and goes to the store and buys their record, that I should get paid. It just seems insane to me. So it's a system I won't participate in.
And it happens a lot in the industry, right?
It's more prevalent in the case of major labels, where there's a kind of a standard arrangement for accounting these things, and it became kind of a standard part of record contracts with major labels. In the underground and in the independent level sphere, it's not as common, and I think it's the kind of thing that will probably die a natural death. Like, that kind of relationship probably won't survive for that much longer, just because it's, on its face, it's absurd.
I remember watching you on BBC, and they were trying your songs on an iPod. You thought it was lacking the bassy sound of Shellac, right?
Okay, yeah. I don't listen to music that way normally. I don't own any earbuds. I didn't own an iPod. When I was a child, I would play a record and listen to it. When I was a teenager, I would play a record and listen to it. As an adult, I play a record and I listen to it. I don't need music on my phone. I don't need music on my computer and in an elevator, or coming out of my refrigerator, or coming out,
Ted were small and riding bikes along the wall, stealing things and breaking things. I had my back, he had his, and each one had the other's.
And now a subject that is inevitable for me to ask you about, that it was how I first knew about your work. It was listening to In Utero. And I know that there's a lot of controversial things about that period. Kurt Cobain was facing a lot of problems.
They were in an unusual circumstance with their record label, because when they were signed, there weren't great expectations on them that they were going to be a huge hit. and it was a surprise to everyone that they became the biggest band in the world. So it was very unusual circumstances that they found themselves in. And considering all of those pressures and considering how strange that experience must be, I think they navigated it about as well as a band could. On a personal level, like I was never involved in Kurt Cobain's personal life at all. As near as I could tell, he was sober and attentive and productive. We made the record in a very short amount of time, and he was
2 weeks, right?
He was there, and he was active and making conscious choices the entire time. So for me, my experience with him was as a very serious musician, someone who was trying very hard to make a record that he was proud of, and working in concert with his bandmates in a very sort of very friendly, very social way.
I have to, they're calling me. I have to work now. Here, take.
Well, rock on.
Take the baby.
I didn't see anything strange or weird. It was very much like doing any other record for me.
Mm-hmm.
I do recognize that the record was more important because they were they were a super huge famous band.
Nevermind, too, yeah.
Because of them being a big famous band. But the process of making the record was a very normal one for me.
Mm-hmm. Was he a guy who applied himself like with the technicities, like trying to find a guitar sound?
He had certain pieces of equipment that he relied on, like a certain guitar, a certain amplifier, a certain fuzz pedal, and he would experiment for a bit on his own and come up with a sound that he was satisfied with, and that was the sound. It was never a matter of him like asking the ether, like, what should this sound like? He always had a mental image of what he was trying to do, and he was capable of doing it. So yeah.
And he did the settings by himself, like the treble, the bass.
I wasn't involved in any of that.
Yeah, that's nice. I would like to talk to you a little bit about politics. I don't know if you were exposed to what is happening in Brazil right now. We have a fascist in the government, and I would like to know how is your political orientation, because punk inherently it's like having anarchism attached to it.
The people that I involved with myself with personally were all of a progressive mindset. We're all leftists and some anarchists, some revolutionary communist type people, but everyone was of a progressive mind. I didn't know, talking about in the 1970s, 1980s, I didn't know any punks who were right-wing, right-wing leaning or conservative in the conventional sense. There were a lot of people in those circles who used the historical images of fascism, or that used the historical signifiers of fascism for shock value. Like the Ramones, for example, like Didi Ramon would be wearing a swastika t-shirt, right? He wasn't a Nazi. He was using the swastika as a way to shock complacent people or people who had a sense of propriety. So at the time, in the 70s and the 80s, this imagery was less welded to an ideology, right? And over time, that ideology reasserted itself, and these images have become reattached to the ideology. So you don't see bands using fascist imagery in their artwork for mere shock value. Now, if you see a fascist image or a slogan or something like that that reads as fascist or right-wing, it probably is fascist or right-wing, and that wasn't the case when I was, forming my identity as a musician. Like all of these things were being played with or being used in either an ironic sense, and I don't mean to excuse it as irony, but using these images and this kind of thinking and this kind of language as separated from the political ideology. And I think that was a failure on our part as the music scene, not recognizing that there was still a nascent or a latent hunger for this kind of authoritarianism. I know, a lot of my peer bands, my friends and my peers used these kinds of images and my band played with these kinds of images and stuff. Mm-hmm. And I feel a sense of a little bit of guilt about that. And I feel a sense of naivete, like we were being naive about how actually dangerous this sort of authoritarianism as a genuine political ideology was. Like, it just seemed like it was such a solved problem. It seemed like caveman stuff,
Yeah.
Like, and yeah, it's depressing to see us still having to fight these same battles. It's depressing.
It's weird to see like musicians denying science, right? For example, you are a man of science, right? Sound engineering is a science, right? And then people that are refusing to take the vaccine, and there was a guy, Stefan Carpenter from the Deftones, and he said, I'm not feeling safe to leave the country right now. He doesn't want to take the vaccine, and then he believes that the earth is flat and stuff like that. So it's a nonsense.
I agree with you that that's nonsense, but I also, I don't think that musicians are necessarily a special kind of person. I just feel like culturally at the moment there is a kind of an indulgence. Like, people are eager to allow for both sides of every question, when there are some questions that really only have one side. You know?
Yeah, even the word fan comes from fanatic, right?
Yeah.
And I would prefer to call people like listeners, right? It's much better. It's weird, that cult of personality.
Jesus Christ, I'm shaking! Have something shake before it falls!
I would like to give you a gift. It's from a band from São Paulo. It's called Test.
Okay.
Let's open this. I think I have a key here.
Old record store trick.
Oh, much better.
Ooh, colorful vinyl.
Yeah. O jogo humano in Portuguese. In English, it would be like the human game. And the cool thing here is, if you take the titles of the songs, you can construct the order by putting phrases. So it's good for you to learn some adjectives, verbs, and nouns in Portuguese. Cool. My preferred one is the third track. I usually start from the third, and then I go constructing phrases. This is why it's called the human game. I hope you like it. It's like a duo, just two guys playing. Mm-hmm. Guitar, vocals from John Combi, and the drummer is Barata. It's a cool thing. I think you're going to enjoy it.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Give them my regards.
Okay. That's it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome.